The morning Minnie Bailey walked out to her property line with her late husband's Winchester in one hand and the deed to the Bailey homestead in the other. The sun had not yet fully cleared the rim of the Oklahoma Territory hills, and the dew was still heavy on the buffalo grass, and she had not slept in 2 days. She had heard the horses before she saw them. 4 of them coming up the eastern trail at a pace that said these men were not in any particular hurry, which told her everything she needed to know about how confident they were. Men who expected trouble moved fast. Men who expected none moved the way these men moved, slow and easy and spreading out as they came, like a hand opening before it closed into a fist. Minnie planted her boots at the cedar post she and her husband Gerald had driven into the earth together 3 years prior, the post with the rusted tin marker that read Bailey Land, Est 1886, and she unfolded the deed in her left hand and raised the Winchester with her right, and she waited. She was 29 years old. She had been a widow for 6 weeks. She had a daughter named Clara who was 8 years old and asleep in the house behind her, and that house and the 160 acres surrounding it were all that stood between Clara and a life of absolute destitution. So Minnie Bailey stood at her property line and she did not move. The riders pulled up short when they saw her. The one in front was a heavy-set man named Cord Prout, who worked as the land agent and general enforcer for a cattle baron named Harlan Voss, who had been buying up land in the Cimarron Strip for 2 years by methods that ranged from legal to barely legal to the kind that happened at night and left no witnesses. Prout had a thick black mustache and small eyes that sat too close together, and he looked at Minnie the way men like him always looked at women who stood in their way, like she was an inconvenience that would dissolve if he simply looked at it long enough. "Mrs. Bailey," he said, touching the brim of his hat with one finger in a gesture that was so insincere it was almost an insult by itself. "We have papers from the territorial court saying this land reverts to the Voss Cattle Company pending payment of outstanding debts incurred by the late Gerald Bailey." "I have the original deed," Minnie said. Her voice did not waver. She had practiced that, standing at the window in the dark hours before dawn, rehearsing the steadiness she needed to perform. "Registered at the county seat in Beaver City. Filed October 3, 1886. This land belongs to the Bailey estate, which means it belongs to me and my daughter, and no court in the territory has issued any order I have seen or signed." Prout smiled. It was not a kind smile. "Now, Mrs. Bailey, your husband borrowed considerable money from Mr. Voss. And with Gerald gone, those debts fall to. You show me the promissory note," Minnie said. "You show me Gerald's signature on a document that pledges this land as collateral, and you show me the court order, and I will read every word of it. Until then, you and your men are standing on my land, and I am asking you to leave it." She tilted the Winchester slightly, just enough to let the morning light catch the barrel. Prout's smile flickered. He looked at the rifle and then he looked at her face, and whatever he found there made him choose words instead of action, at least for this morning. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Minnie agreed. "It is not, but you are still leaving." They left. She stood at the cedar post until the sound of their horses faded entirely, and then her legs began to shake, and she let them shake because there was no one watching anymore. And then she walked back to the house and sat down at the kitchen table and put the deed and the rifle side by side and pressed her palms flat on the table and breathed. Clara appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, her dark hair tangled from sleep, her eyes wide and serious. She had Gerald's eyes, that particular shade of gray that looked different in every light. "Was it the men again?" Clara asked. "It was," Minnie said, "but they are gone now. Come have breakfast." She made cornmeal porridge and did not tell Clara what she had already decided, which was that she needed help and that she had run out of people to ask. The town of Caldwell sat just inside the Kansas line, south of Wichita, and it had seen better days. It had been a proper cattle town once, the end of the Kishom Trail, loud and violent and alive with the commerce of 1,000 longhorns passing through every season. By 1889, the trail had shifted and the railheads had changed, and Caldwell had settled into something quieter and more ordinary, though it retained enough of the old roughness to make a woman traveling alone through it keep her chin up and her eyes forward. Minnie came to Caldwell because that was where the lawyer was. His name was Elias Webb, and he had handled the original filing of the Bailey deed, and he was the only person she could think of who might know what legal ground she actually stood on. She left Clara with her neighbor, a Mennonite widow named Ruth Schraber, who had her own 8 acres and her own troubles, and who nevertheless took Clara without question and pressed 2 biscuits into Minnie's hands for the road. The ride to Caldwell took most of a day on the roan mare she called Patience, which was what you needed to ride her. Minnie arrived in the late afternoon, tied Patience at the post outside Webb's office, and went inside. Elias Webb was 63, thin as a fence rail, with ink-stained fingers and a manner of speaking that was always slightly behind the speed at which he was thinking, so that his sentences arrived in careful, measured pieces. He listened to everything Minnie told him, from Gerald's death from the fever in early March to Prout's appearances and the claims about debts to Voss, and when she finished he was quiet for a long time. "The deed is solid," he said finally. "Gerald filed it properly and it is registered." However, he folded his hands. If Gerald did sign promissory notes with Voss, and if those notes were witnessed and notarized, and if Voss's people take them to a sympathetic judge, which in this territory is not difficult to arrange, they can get an order of foreclosure that would supersede the deed. "Did Gerald sign anything?" Minnie asked. "I don't know. Gerald handled his own financial affairs. Did he ever mention borrowing from Voss?" Minnie thought about the winter 2 years ago when the prices had fallen and Gerald had come home from town quiet and tight-lipped for a week. "He may have," she said quietly. "He never told me the details." Webb made a pained sound. "Then we need to know. If there are notes, we need to see them and we need to determine if they are legitimate or if Voss had them fabricated, which is something I would not put past him." "How do I find out?" "You could hire someone to look into it. Someone who knows Voss's operations and who is not afraid of him." Webb pulled at his chin. "There is a man. He was a lawman deputized out of Fort Supply before the trouble there. He works independently now. He came through here last week and he mentioned he was staying in town for a few days. Name of Thomas Holloway." Minnie looked at him steadily. "What kind of man is he?" "The kind who does what he says he will do," Webb said. "And the kind who has already gone up against Voss once before and is still breathing, which puts him in a very small category." "Where do I find him?" Webb told her. The Monarch Hotel in Caldwell was a 2-story clapboard building that smelled of old wood and tobacco and the particular mustiness of a place where many different people had slept badly. The woman at the desk, a broad-shouldered German immigrant named Hilda, told Minnie that Mr. Holloway was in the dining room. Minnie found him at a corner table, eating what appeared to be a very serious plate of beans and salt pork. He was younger than she had expected from Webb's description, somewhere around 32 or 33, with the kind of face that the Western sun had been working on for years, but which had not yet surrendered its original structure. He had dark hair that needed cutting, a few days of dark beard, and brown eyes that lifted immediately when she entered the room and tracked her across the space with the attentiveness of someone who had spent years in situations where not noticing things got you killed. He stood when she reached the table, which she had not expected. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "my name is Minnie Bailey. Elias Webb sent me." "Mrs. Bailey." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please sit down." She sat. She placed the deed on the table between them because it was becoming a habit now, having it where she could see it, and he looked at it, and then he looked at her, and his expression did not change except in some small quality of attention that sharpened slightly. "You are having trouble with Harlan Voss," he said. It was not a question. "His man Cord Prout has come to my property line twice claiming my husband owed Voss a debt secured by the land. I believe it is either fraudulent or exaggerated well beyond what Gerald actually borrowed. if he borrowed anything at all. Mr. Webb says you know Voss's operations. I do, Thomas said. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her with that careful attention. May I ask how recently you lost your husband? 6 weeks ago. She said it flatly because that was how she could say it without her voice doing things she did not want it to do. Fever. He was 31 years old. Something moved through Thomas Holloway's face that was not pity because it did not have the condescension pity carried. It was more like recognition, the look of someone who understood that life ended sentences before they were finished. I am sorry, he said, and he meant it. Mr. Holloway, I do not need condolences as much as I need someone who can find out whether Harlan Voss holds a legitimate note against my land, and if he does not, help me prove it. He was quiet for a moment. He picked up his coffee cup, drank from it, set it down. You understand that looking into Voss's paperwork is not a simple or entirely safe undertaking. I have an 8-year-old daughter and everything I own in the world on the other side of the Cimarron, Minnie said. I understand quite clearly what is at stake. He looked at her for a long beat. Then something settled in his expression, some internal calculation resolved. What can you pay? It was a fair question and she had prepared for it. I have $40 in cash, which is nearly everything I have liquid. I also have 40 acres on the north side of my property that I can deed over as payment once the matter is resolved, if you would prefer land. He shook his head at the 40 acres. Keep your land, Mrs. Bailey. The $40 will do. And I will need to know everything you know about your husband's dealings with Voss, every conversation you can remember, every piece of paper you have in the house. I can do that. Then I will ride out tomorrow morning. She nodded and stood, and he stood again, and she was already turning to leave when he said, Mrs. Bailey. She turned back. You said Prout came to your property line twice. Did he come alone? The first time he had 2 men. This morning he had 3. Thomas Holloway absorbed that with a slight tightening of his jaw. All right, he said. I will be there before sunup tomorrow. She rode home through the dark with the roan mare's hooves steady on the packed dirt road, and the stars pressing down close and cold and enormous. And she told herself that she had done what needed doing, which was true. And she told herself she felt nothing about Thomas Holloway except the pragmatic relief of having secured some form of assistance, which was mostly true. He came the way he had said he would, before the sun was fully up, riding a big gray horse that moved with an ease that matched its rider. Clara was awake and at the window, and announced his arrival with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child who had already decided to observe all new things closely before deciding what she thought of them. Minnie met him on the porch. He took off his hat and held it, which was something she noticed without meaning to, and she showed him inside and put coffee on and set the papers she had collected on the kitchen table. There were not many. Gerald had not been a man who kept extensive records. There was the original deed, a receipt from the hardware in Caldwell for wire fencing purchased in '87, 2 letters from Gerald's brother in Missouri, and at the very bottom of the tin box where Gerald kept such things, a folded note in Gerald's handwriting that read, Voss, $300, 6% spring repayment. It was not witnessed, not notarized, not dated precisely except for a notation that said February '88. Thomas picked it up and read it twice. $300, he said, that is all. That is all I can find. Voss will claim it is more, he always does. He set the note down carefully. This is informal. It would not hold up in a serious court as a deed-securing instrument because there is nothing here that says the land was pledged against it. It says he borrowed money, not that he borrowed it against the land. Minnie felt something ease slightly in her chest. So Prout is bluffing. Prout is doing what Voss told him to do, which may include producing a more formal-looking document that bears your husband's signature, whether Gerald actually signed it or not. Thomas looked at her. This is how Voss works. He has a man, a former clerk from the Territorial Land Office, who can produce convincing paperwork. His name is Silas Crane. If we can find out whether Crane has drawn up documents relating to your land and get our hands on them before they are filed, we have a case. How do we do that? I do that, he said. You stay here and keep the rifle loaded. Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway at that precise moment, having clearly been listening from around the corner, and looked at Thomas with frank appraisal. Are you a lawman? She asked. Clara, Minnie said. It is a fair question, Thomas said, and looked at Clara directly, which children always noticed and appreciated. I was a deputy marshal. Now I am just a man who helps people with problems. Clara considered this. Can you shoot? Clara. Yes, Thomas said. Can you? Clara's face brightened. Mama is teaching me. I can hit a tin can at 30 feet. That is better than some men I have ridden with, Thomas said gravely, and Clara beamed, and Minnie looked at the ceiling briefly and then looked back at Thomas and found him already looking at her with the beginning of something in his expression that he seemed to immediately place away, deliberately, the way you put something down that you do not yet have a place for. I will ride toward Fort Supply today, he said, returning to business with a completeness that almost convinced her nothing had passed between them. Crane operates out of a settlement called Gypsum Creek, about 12 miles east. I know someone there who can tell me if Crane has been busy lately. Be careful, Minnie said, and then felt slightly foolish for saying it, as though he needed her to tell him that. But Thomas Holloway looked at her when she said it and said, I will, without any of the dismissiveness that the words might have carried, and then he put his hat back on and went out and mounted the gray horse and rode east into the risen sun. He came back 2 days later, and in the interval Minnie did not allow herself to be anxious about Thomas Holloway specifically. She was anxious in general, which was different. She repaired fencing on the south pasture and kept the rifle close, and had Ruth Schraber come to stay the nights with her and Clara, because Ruth was the kind of woman whose presence was itself a form of protection, wide and calm and immovable. When Thomas rode up on the evening of the second day, the light was going golden and long across the grass, and he had a leather satchel across his saddle that had not been there when he left. He sat at the kitchen table and opened the satchel and laid out 3 pieces of paper, and they were indeed formal-looking documents, the kind with official-appearing borders and careful script, and they bore what was meant to look like Gerald Bailey's signature. Crane made them, Thomas said. My contact confirmed he was paid by Voss last month to produce a promissory note and a collateral agreement. These are copies I obtained. He paused. Do not ask how I obtained them. Minnie looked at the papers and then looked at the note from the tin box, the one in Gerald's own hand. That is not his signature, she said. She touched the document with one finger. Gerald had a particular way of writing his name. He crossed his G very low. Whoever did this crossed it high. Thomas looked where she pointed. He looked at the original note and then at the forged document. You are right, he said. That is a good catch, Mrs. Bailey. I know my husband's handwriting. There was a silence, and it was not an uncomfortable one, and that was perhaps the beginning of something. That particular silence where 2 people recognize that they are not uncomfortable together and notice it simultaneously. Webb can take these to the proper territorial court, Thomas said. Not the local judge, who Voss has in his pocket, but the federal circuit court out of Guthrie. There is a judge there named Arlen Marsh who is entirely incorruptible and who has been wanting a legitimate case against Voss for 2 years. Will it be enough? The forgery, combined with the original note showing a much smaller amount and no land pledge, combined with testimony from my contact about Crane being paid to produce the documents. Thomas looked at her steadily. It will be enough to at minimum stop any foreclosure proceedings and open an investigation into Voss, which will keep Prude off your property line. Minnie sat back in her chair and for just a moment allowed herself to feel the relief of it, the enormous, shaky, almost embarrassing relief of having a plan that might actually work. Mr. Holloway, she said, thank you. It is not finished yet, he said, but we have good pieces in hand. Still, she met his eyes. Thank you. He looked at her the way he had in the hotel dining room, that quality of careful attention, and this time he did not immediately look away. and she found that she also did not immediately look away. Then Clara came bounding in from the back room wanting to know if Mr. Holloway would stay for supper, and the moment dissolved into the ordinary noise of a child who had decided she approved of someone, and Minnie found herself saying, "Yes, there is enough stew." And Thomas Holloway stayed for supper and talked to Clara about horses, which Clara could discuss with alarming depth for an 8-year-old. And Minnie sat across the table from him and watched him treat her daughter like a person worth talking to. And something shifted in her chest in a way she was not prepared for and had not invited. The ride to Guthrie took 3 days. Thomas had suggested he could go alone, but Minnie had been firm. The documents were hers. The deed was hers. Her name was on everything. She would go. She arranged for Ruth Schraber to stay at the Bailey place with Clara, a decision Clara protested with the specific theatrical grievance of a child who suspects she is being protected from something interesting. Minnie kissed her daughter's forehead and told her she would be back in a week, and rode out with Thomas on a Tuesday morning in late April with the territory wildflowers just beginning to come up yellow and purple across the flats. They rode the first hours with the kind of conversation that is really about establishing whether conversation is possible at all. Thomas asked her about the land, how she and Gerald had come to Homestead in the Cimarron Strip, and she told him about coming from Indiana, about Gerald's certainty that the territory would open and they would be among the first families to stake a real claim. He was right about that, she said. He was right about most things practical. He had good instincts for land and animals and weather. He was not always right about people. Thomas heard the weight she gave that last sentence and did not press it, which she appreciated. She would tell the rest of that story eventually, or she would not. By the second morning, camped in the lee of a limestone outcrop with a fire going, and the plains enormous and dark in every direction, the conversation had deepened without either of them particularly planning it. Thomas told her about Fort Supply, about the years of deputy work along the border of the Oklahoma Territory during the years before the land runs, when the nations were still nations, and the Strip was a chaos of cattlemen and outlaws and settlers who had jumped the line early, and the army trying to hold a line that kept moving. He told it without self-importance, not the way men sometimes told stories of danger with themselves large at the center, but matter-of-factly as though the events had simply happened and he had simply been there. "Why did you leave the marshals?" she asked. It was forward, but the fire and the dark had a loosening effect on social convention. He was quiet for a moment, poking the fire with a stick. "I lost a man who was under my care," he said. "A young deputy. He was 21. He had a wife in Dodge City. I made a decision that I thought was tactically sound, and he paid for it." He set down the stick. "I still believe I made the right decision with the information I had. I also cannot unknow what that decision cost. The two things sit together in a way that does not fully resolve." Minnie looked into the fire. "Gerald borrowed money from Voss because he was trying to protect me from knowing how tight things were," she said. "He thought he could handle it and pay it back before I knew. He meant to protect me, and the keeping of that secret is part of what has left me in this position." She paused. "I understand about decisions that do not fully resolve." Thomas looked at her across the fire with an expression she could not entirely read in the flickering light. "You are a very frank woman, Mrs. Bailey." "I am a very tired woman," she said. "Tired women tend to say the actual thing." He smiled at that. It was the first time she had seen him smile fully, and it changed his face entirely, made it younger and warmer and more open, and she looked back at the fire because she felt that looking at it too directly would be like looking at the sun. They arrived in Guthrie on a Thursday afternoon. Guthrie was an extraordinary thing to see, a city that had not existed on the morning of April 22nd, 1889. And which had 50,000 people by nightfall of that same day, the result of the great land run that had opened the unassigned lands of the territory. It was still raw and loud and unfinished, half wood buildings and half canvas and all noise, but it had a federal courthouse and a circuit court judge named Arlen Marsh, and that was what they had come for. They took separate rooms at a boarding house on 2nd Street, and Minnie noted with an emotion she did not entirely examine that she was slightly sorry about this, and immediately chastised herself for being slightly sorry about it. The meeting with Judge Marsh was not like Minnie had imagined a meeting with a federal judge would be. She had expected formality and distance. What she got was a compact, gray-whiskered man of about 55 who sat behind his desk and read the documents. They brought him with his glasses pushed up on his forehead and read them again properly, and then looked at them over the rims in a way that communicated a great deal. "Holloway," he said, "you were at Fort Supply." "Yes, sir." "And you obtained these how?" "Through a source I would prefer not to name in the interest of their continued health and well-being." Marsh made a sound that was almost a laugh. He looked at Minnie. "This is your land, Mrs. Bailey." "It is, sir. I have the original registered deed." She laid it on the desk and he studied it. "And this," he said, picking up the original note in Gerald's handwriting, "is the only genuine document relating to any arrangement between your husband and Harlan Voss." "To my knowledge, yes. And the signature on the forged documents does not match my husband's actual hand in a specific and demonstrable way." Marsh looked at her steadily. "You know your husband's handwriting." "I read every letter he ever wrote me," she said quietly. Something in the judge's face gentled briefly. He set the papers down and folded his hands. "What I can do today is issue a temporary injunction preventing any foreclosure or eviction proceedings against the Bailey homestead pending a full federal investigation into the documents produced by this man Crane and their connection to Harlan Voss. I can have that injunction in your hands within the hour." Minnie felt the breath go out of her. "Yes," she said, "please." "The full investigation will take time," Marsh said. "Voss has resources. But once we open an official inquiry and it becomes clear that his document production scheme is under federal scrutiny, he tends to retreat. He is not brave, Mrs. Bailey. He is simply relentless, and relentless men stop when they encounter a wall." "Then let us be a wall," Thomas said. Marsh looked at him and nodded once. "Indeed." The injunction was in Minnie's hands before the afternoon was out, and she stood on the steps of the federal courthouse in Guthrie with the paper in her hand and the Oklahoma sun coming down warm on her shoulders, and felt something she had not felt in 6 weeks, which was the specific sensation of ground under her feet that was not about to give way. Thomas was standing beside her, and she turned to look at him and found him already looking at her, and she knew that her face was doing something she was not controlling it to do. Something open and relieved and glad, and she did not try to stop it. "It is not everything," he said, "but it is solid footing." "It is solid footing," she agreed. And then, because the relief was large and the sun was warm and she was a tired woman who said the actual thing, she said, "I am glad you were in Caldwell when Webb sent me." His jaw moved slightly like he was tasting the words before deciding what to say back. "So am I," he said. And then carefully, as though placing something down gently, "Mrs. Bailey, Minnie." Her given name in his voice was different from how it was in her own head, and she noticed that. "I would like to see this through to the end with you. The investigation, the final resolution, and after that." He stopped. She looked at him directly. "After that what?" "I'm not sure yet," he said honestly. "I thought it was fair to say that there is an after that which I am thinking about." The territorial wind came across the prairie and moved a strand of her hair across her face, and she did not reach up to push it back. "I think," she said carefully, "that is the most careful way any man has ever said something of that kind to me, and I find that I am thinking about an after that as well." She looked back at the courthouse. "But first we finish this." "Yes," Thomas said, "first we finish this." They rode back to the Bailey homestead in a different kind of silence than they had ridden out in. It was not an empty silence. It was the kind that is full of everything that has been said and everything that has not been said yet but will be, and both of them seemed to understand that, and both of them seemed all right with it. When they came over the last rise and the homestead came into view below them in the afternoon light, the house and the barn and the kitchen garden, and the cedar post with its rusted marker. Minnie felt something so sharp and fierce and protective move through her that her hands tightened on the reins and patience tossed her head. Clara came running out of the house before they had fully dismounted, with Ruth Schraber behind her at a more dignified pace, and Clara seized Minnie around the middle, and Minnie put her face into her daughter's hair and held on. "Did it work?" Clara demanded, pulling back to look up at her. "Yes," Minnie said. "It worked." Clara turned immediately to Thomas. "Did you help?" "A little," he said. "A lot," Minnie corrected, and looked at him over Clara's head, and he looked back, and Ruth Schraber, who missed nothing, looked between them and made a small sound of satisfaction that she disguised as clearing her throat. Cord Prout came back one more time. He came alone, which either meant he was testing the waters or he was stupid, and given that he came in the mid-morning when the light was full, and Minnie was out in the yard with the Winchester in the crook of her arm turning the kitchen garden, it was probably both. He pulled up at the property line and looked at her and looked at the rifle, and then he looked at the man who was up on the barn roof replacing shingles, because Thomas had found reasons to remain on the Bailey property while the federal inquiry was ongoing, and the reasons kept being practical ones related to the extensive repairs the place needed, and this had been accepted by both of them as an arrangement. "You filed with the federal court," Prout said. He was not smiling this time. "I did," Minnie said. She did not stop what she was doing, which was tamping soil around a row of bean seedlings. The rifle was in easy reach. "Mr. Voss is not pleased." "Mr. Voss's displeasure is not my concern." She straightened up and looked at him. "Mr. Voss has a problem. And the problem is that his document man, Silas Crane, produced forged notes bearing my husband's name, and the federal court has those documents now, and is comparing them to verified samples of my husband's handwriting, and Mr. Voss is going to find that the cost of pursuing this matter will become considerably higher than any profit he imagined from my 160 acres. Prout looked at Thomas on the barn roof, who had stopped working and was simply watching. There was nothing overtly threatening in Thomas's posture, nothing theatrical. He was just watching, with that particular quality of stillness that said very clearly that he was paying complete attention. "This is not finished," Prout said, but it came out thinner this time, less like a promise and more like a man trying to remember his lines. "Actually," Thomas said from the roof, "it is. Voss has received the federal notice. His own lawyer, a man named Gilmore in Dodge City, has advised him in writing to abandon the Bailey claim to avoid a broader fraud investigation. I have a copy of that advice. Mr. Prout, you are welcome to tell your employer that continuing to send men to this property line will be considered harassment under federal territorial statute, and the next visit will be documented and submitted to Judge Marsh directly." The silence that followed was long. Prout looked at Minnie, and she held his gaze without difficulty, because she was no longer afraid of Cord Prout. She had been afraid of him when he was the representative of something massive and certain. Now he was just a man with a difficult employer and a rapidly diminishing position. He turned his horse and rode away, and this time Minnie knew he would not come back. Thomas came down off the barn roof and walked across the yard toward her, wiping his hands on a cloth, and she looked at him, and she started to say something practical and grateful and sensible, and instead what came out was, "How did you get a copy of Gilmore's letter to Voss?" Thomas's expression remained entirely neutral. "I have a number of useful contacts." "You are an infuriating man," she said, and found that she was almost laughing when she said it. "I have been told that," he agreed, and he was very close to smiling, and the afternoon sun was warm, and the kitchen garden smelled of turned earth, and something about the ordinary beauty of the moment was almost too much to hold. "Thomas," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the Mr. before it, and they both noticed that. "Minnie," he said. And she looked at him for a long moment. This man who had ridden into her crisis and worked beside her and helped her hold the line, who had sat at her kitchen table and talked to her daughter like she mattered, who had built a fire on the open prairie and said the actual true things into the dark without decorating them. And she thought about Gerald, who she had loved and who was gone, and she thought about how grief and love were not enemies of each other but simply different seasons. And she thought about the cedar post with its rusted marker and the 160 acres, and the bean seedlings just now putting out their first true leaves, and she said, "I think we should talk about that after that you mentioned in Guthrie." Thomas Holloway looked at her with the full weight of his attention and said, "Yes, I think we should." The conversation about after that took place over several weeks, because there was work to do and Clara to consider, and a kind of natural unhurried pace to things in the territory that was itself a form of honesty. You did not rush a good thing any more than you rushed good land. You showed up for it day after day, and let it build into what it was going to be. Thomas had a bedroll in the barn, and then Ruth Schraber, with her typical practical warmth, pointed out that there was a perfectly good room going unused since Gerald's passing, and with Clara's visible delight at the suggestion and Minnie's careful acceptance of it, Thomas moved into the small back room and contributed to the morning chores and the evening meals and the general business of keeping a homestead alive. He was good with animals. The roan mare Patience, who had bitten 3 people in her life, accepted Thomas on the second day, which Clara declared to be a sign of something important, and Minnie privately agreed but did not say so. He was patient in the way that men who have been through hard things sometimes learn to be, patient not as a strategy but as a genuine quality of character, so that when something went wrong, the fence boards that rotted through or the late frost that took half the kitchen garden seedlings, his first response was to assess rather than react. She watched him. She could not help watching him. She watched the way he thought, which showed in his face in small, controlled ways that she was learning to read, and she watched the way he was with Clara, matter-of-fact and respectful, and occasionally very funny in a dry, understated way that made Clara laugh, the particular helpless laugh she rarely gave to adults. And he watched her. She felt it and did not mind it. He watched her the way someone watches a thing they find genuinely interesting, not predatory attention, but attentive attention, the kind you give to things you want to understand. One evening in late May they sat on the porch after Clara was asleep, and the night sky over the territory was doing the thing it did, putting up so many stars it seemed almost aggressive, like it was trying to make a point. There was a Chuckwill's widow calling from the cottonwoods down by the creek, and the warm air smelled of grass and distant rain. Thomas said, "I want to tell you something and I want to be honest about it." "All right," Minnie said. "I do not have much," he said. "I have the gray horse and some cash saved from the work I have done, and the gear I carry. I have not put down roots anywhere because after Fort Supply I stopped being sure I knew how to do that without making a decision that hurt someone." Minnie was quiet, listening. "But I think," he said, "that what happened at Fort Supply was not a reason to never make decisions. I think it was a reason to make them more carefully. And I have been here 6 weeks and I have been careful and I have arrived at something." "What have you arrived at?" she asked softly. He turned to look at her in the dark. "That I would like to stay, not as hired help and not as a man waiting to be told when to leave. I want to stay because you are the most." He stopped and started again. "Because being here with you and Clara is the first time in 3 years I have felt like I was in the right place." The Chuckwill's widow called again from the cottonwoods, and the grass moved in a slow wave across the fields, and Minnie Bailey sat with her hands folded in her lap and felt the full weight of what was being offered, and the full weight of what she had lost, and the full weight of what remained possible. And she found that all 3 weights were manageable when she held them together. "I am not finished grieving Gerald," she said. "I want you to know that." "I know that," he said. "I am not asking you to be. And I am not," she breathed, "I am not a simple woman. I have opinions and I am not shy about them, and I will want an equal say in everything that concerns this land and this household and this family." "I would expect nothing less," he said, and the simplicity of his expectation was the thing that undid her slightly, because it was so completely without the condescension or resistance that she had half prepared herself for. "Then yes," she said, "I want you to stay." The silence that followed was very full. He reached over and covered her folded hands with one of his, and she turned her hand over so their fingers could lace together, and they sat like that in the dark, with the stars going enormous overhead and the territory spread out all around them. And it was not nothing, this moment. It was the first real beginning of something that both of them had stopped believing would come. Ruth Schraber, when Minnie told her the next morning, made the small, satisfied sound again, this time not bothering to disguise it as anything else, and said, "It is about time," and then immediately began discussing what needed to be done to make the back room more permanent, which Minnie found both endearing and slightly overwhelming. Clara, when told, sat very still for a moment in the particular way that meant she was thinking something through carefully and completely, and then looked at Thomas with direct and serious eyes and said, "Are you going to be my new papa?" The question landed in the kitchen like a stone in still water, and Minnie watched Thomas receive it without flinching. He crouched down so he was at Clara's level, which she noticed he always did when he spoke to her seriously, and he said, "I am not going to try to be your father. Your father was a specific person, and you will always be his daughter. But I am going to be here every day, and I am going to take care of you and your mother, and I am going to love you both the way a person ought to love the people they chose to stay with. Is that all right with you?" Clara studied him for what felt like a very long time. Then she said, "Yes," in a small, decisive voice that left no room for argument, and went back to her breakfast, and Minnie turned away to look out the window and kept her face very still. The federal investigation into Harlan Voss's land acquisition methods continued through the summer, and by August, Silas Crane had agreed to testify in exchange for reduced charges, and 3 other families in the Cimarron Strip who had been pressured and displaced by Voss's forged documents came forward with their own evidence, and it became clear to everyone, including Voss's attorney Gilmore in Dodge City, that the whole scheme was going to come apart. Harlan Voss himself left the territory in September. He departed for Texas with what remained of his cattle operation and never returned, and Cord Prout went with him or perhaps went elsewhere, because he was not seen in the area again either. Judge Marsh issued a final order in October confirming the Bailey homestead deed as clear and uncontested, with no outstanding claims of any kind, and Webb wrote Minnie a letter from Caldwell that read simply, "It is done, Mrs. Bailey. Your land is your land." She read the letter at the kitchen table with Thomas across from her and Clara beside her, and she read it twice, and then she folded it and put it in the tin box beside Gerald's original note and the new deed and the federal injunction, all the papers that had made and kept her home. "It is done," she said. Thomas nodded. "It is done." Clara, who had been waiting with the specific impatience of someone who has been told that when a thing is finished they can ask for something, immediately said, "Can we plant more apple trees now? You said when things were settled." "I did say that," Minnie confirmed. "Yes, we can plant apple trees." They were married on a Saturday in November by a Methodist minister who came through the area on a circuit, and the wedding was held in the yard of the Bailey homestead, because Minnie wanted to be married in the place she had fought to keep, standing on the ground that was hers, with the cedar post with its rusted marker visible from where they stood. Ruth Schraber was there, and a family named Pierce from 3 miles east who had become friends that summer, and the minister's wife who played a small portable organ that she carried in the back of their wagon, and Clara, who wore a calico dress that Minnie had made for her, and who stood beside her mother, with an expression of such bright, concentrated happiness that it was almost hard to look at directly. Thomas Holloway stood in front of the minister in a clean white shirt and his best dark jacket that he had ridden to Caldwell to buy, and that fit him well enough, and his hair was combed and his face was shaved smooth. And when Minnie walked out of the house toward him across the November grass with the sky going blue and deep overhead, He looked at her the way she had seen him look at very few things, with his whole face open and the careful reservation entirely gone. She reached him and they stood facing each other, and the minister said the words that ministers say. And when it came time for the part about speaking now or forever holding your peace, Clara said, very clearly and with absolute sincerity, "He is good," which broke the solemnity in the kindest possible way, and even the minister laughed. Minnie said her vows looking into Thomas's brown eyes, and he said his looking into hers. And when he put his mother's ring on her finger, it fit as though it had been made for her hand. And she felt a fullness so complete it was almost a physical sensation, like a vessel that has been empty for too long and has finally been filled to the brim. The minister pronounced them married, and Thomas kissed her, and Clara immediately embraced them both simultaneously from the side, grabbing an arm each. And Ruth Schraber played something on the portable organ that was probably a hymn, but felt more like a celebration. And the Pierce family's 3 boys ran through the yard shouting, because boys of that age at celebrations always did. And the afternoon sun came across the plains and caught everything in a light that was warm and golden and particular to that hour and that season. And Minnie Bailey, who was now Minnie Holloway though she kept Bailey in her name as well, thought that this was what it felt like when something terrible had happened and you had stood your ground and the ground had held and something new had grown up through the cracks. Winter came in hard that year, as Oklahoma Territory winters could, with ice storms that sealed the grass in glass, and mornings so cold the water in the barrel on the porch froze solid before dawn. But the Bailey homestead, which the Holloways had worked all fall to prepare, was tight and warm, with new mortar on the chimney and new boards on the worst of the exterior walls, and the barn rebuilt on its north side where it had been sagging. They fell into the rhythms of the cold months together, the early dark and the long evenings and the work that winter required, which was different from summer work, more internal, more about maintenance and preparation. Thomas was not a man who needed silence to be empty, and Minnie was not a woman who needed noise to be present, and they found a way of being in the same space that was deeply comfortable, each moving in orbit around the other with a naturalness that still occasionally surprised her by its ease. Clara was studying from 2 textbooks Ruth Schraber had lent them, and from a mail-order reader that had arrived in October, and Thomas had taken it upon himself to work through mathematics with her in the evenings after supper, sitting at the kitchen table with Clara between them, and Minnie would read or mend, and listen to the 2 of them work through sums, and occasionally argue good-naturedly about the most efficient method. It was in the deep of January that Minnie told Thomas she was expecting. She had suspected for several weeks and had said nothing while she was sure enough to be certain, and she told him on a Sunday morning when the light was coming in white and cold through the east window, and Clara was still asleep, and the house was very quiet. He was at the stove with his back to her when she said it, and he turned around very slowly, as though sudden movement might disturb the moment, and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was something she could only describe as a man coming home, not arriving somewhere new but recognizing somewhere that had been waiting. "Truly," he said. "Truly," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and held her carefully, the way you hold something you do not want to break but also cannot stand at a distance from, and she put her face against his chest and listened to his heartbeat and felt him breathe. And outside the January wind moved across the frozen territory with its slow, enormous indifference, and inside the small homestead in the Cimarron Strip everything was warm. "A boy or a girl, I will love it completely and absolutely," he said into her hair, "and I will make every attempt to be the kind of father I should be." "I know," she said. "That is not something I wonder about." "Good." He held her a little tighter. "Good." Clara, when told at breakfast, received the news with a thoughtful pause and then said, "I want a brother." She said it with such matter-of-fact certainty that Minnie and Thomas both looked at each other, and the look became a laugh, And that laugh was easy and genuine and full of everything that had been built between them. Spring came back to the Oklahoma territory the way it always did, suddenly and completely. One morning the grass gray and the sky low, and the next morning everything green and the meadowlarks at it from before dawn. The apple tree seedlings they had ordered from a nursery in Kansas arrived in early April, 3 of them, and Clara and Thomas planted them in the east yard on a Saturday while Minnie supervised from the porch with her hands folded on her expanding middle, and the March wind coming warm from the south. The federal investigation into Voss's operations produced its final report that same spring. Silas Crane was convicted of document fraud and sentenced to 2 years in the territorial prison at Guthrie. Voss himself was indicted in absentia on charges relating to land fraud in 4 counties, and while the process of actually bringing him to justice across state lines was complicated, his cattle operation in Texas was seized as part of the proceedings, and his capacity to cause harm in the territory was effectively ended. Webb wrote another letter, longer this time, laying out the details with his careful measured sentences, and Minnie read it to Thomas in the evening and then folded it and put it with the other papers. "Is it enough?" Thomas asked. Not about the legal outcome, but about something larger. Minnie thought about the families who had been displaced and not come back. She thought about the ones who had lost their land before the investigation, before she had been able to fight, the ones who had simply gone because they had no one to go to and no lawyer and no deputy marshal staying in their barn. "For us it is enough," she said. "For everyone it was not, but what was possible we did." Thomas nodded slowly. "That is the right way to hold it," he said. "Gerald would have liked you," she said, and she had not said that before, had not put Gerald and Thomas in the same sentence, and it was a thing she had needed to wait until she could say it honestly, which she now could. He would have been glad. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I am glad too," he said. "I am glad he loved you and built this place and raised Clara and left you strong enough to hold on to it. I am glad all of that happened. It brought me here." She took his hand across the table the way he had taken hers on the porch that night in May, and they held on. The baby was born on a hot afternoon in late July, with Ruth Schraber attending, and Thomas pacing the yard in a state of barely controlled anxiety that Clara thought was very funny and documented with the amused commentary of a 9-year-old, who had decided to find the whole proceeding entertaining rather than alarming. He was a boy, as Clara had requested, 7 pounds and loud about it from the first moment, with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, which was a combination that produced a face of remarkable personal authority for someone who had been in the world for 20 minutes. Thomas held his son with the same careful quality he brought to everything important, his large hands making a cradle of crossed arms, and looked down at the boy's face with an expression so undefended and open that Minnie, exhausted and warm and entirely complete, had to look away for a moment because it was too much to look at directly. "What do we call him?" Thomas asked, his voice low. Minnie had thought about this. She had thought about it for months, quietly turning it over. "Gerald Thomas Holloway," she said, "if that is all right with you." Thomas looked up at her with the full force of what that meant in his eyes and nodded once and said, "Yes, that is exactly right." Clara was allowed into the room then, and she came and looked at her new brother with critical appraisal, and then said, with great generosity, "He is better than I expected," which was the highest form of praise in Clara's economy, and Minnie laughed even though laughing hurt, and Thomas laughed too, and Ruth Schraber made a sound that was definitely not a disguised throat-clearing this time, but just straightforward warm emotion, which she covered by becoming very busy with something on the other side of the room. The years that settled in after that were not without difficulty, because years in the territory never were. There were bad seasons and hard seasons, and one summer when the grass was so dry that fire scares ran through the whole area, and every family spent 2 weeks watching the horizon. There were the ordinary griefs and frustrations of a life built from the ground up, the arguments that came from two strong-willed people sharing a house and a future, and needing to navigate the occasional collision of conviction and habit and differing judgment. They argued sometimes, honestly and occasionally loudly, about the farm and money and decisions, and they always resolved it, not always quickly and not always easily but always completely, because both of them had seen what dishonesty and silence could do to a life and neither of them had any patience for it. Gerald Thomas grew from a loud and opinionated infant into a loud and opinionated toddler, who adored his father with a completeness that was somewhat inconvenient when Minnie was trying to put him to bed, and he wanted Thomas to do it, and who adored his sister Clara in a way that expressed itself primarily as following her everywhere she went and attempting to replicate everything she did, which Clara bore with more grace than might have been expected. 2 years after Gerald Thomas came Margaret, who arrived in February with the snow coming sideways outside, and who was from her first days a quieter and more observational soul than her brother, watching the world with a thoroughness that reminded Minnie powerfully of Thomas, that quality of careful, patient attention that saw things others missed. Thomas looked at his daughter on the first morning of her life and said, "She is going to be smarter than me before she can talk properly." And Minnie said, "Almost certainly." And he grinned and kissed her forehead, and Margaret made a sound that was not quite a smile but was pointed in that direction. Clara grew up in that house, in that territory, under those skies that went on forever. And she grew up strong and clear-headed and entirely herself, in the way that children who are loved well tend to be. She was 16 when she first rode alone to Caldwell for supplies, 19 when she began keeping the homestead accounts with an accuracy and insight that made Webb and Caldwell eventually offer her work as a bookkeeper, which she took with such competent enthusiasm that it turned from part-time work into the beginning of a real career in a world that did not always welcome women into them. But before all of that, before the children grew and the years built, and the apple trees in the east yard put up their first fruit in the fall of 1893, a small crop of hard green apples that Clara ate straight off the branch and declared perfect. Before all of it, there was one particular morning that Minnie carried with her always as a kind of internal landmark. It was a morning in the summer after Gerald Thomas was born, an early August morning when the territory was hot and fragrant, and the sky was the particular pure blue of high summer. Thomas was out working the south fence line, and Clara had taken the baby down to the shade of the cottonwoods with a blanket, and Minnie was in the kitchen garden doing the morning weeding. She was between the bean rows, her hands in the warm earth, and she looked up and saw Thomas coming back from the fence line across the field, his hat pushed back, his stride the one she had memorized without meaning to, the particular way he covered ground. And he looked up and saw her looking at him, and he raised a hand. She raised hers back. It was not a dramatic moment. Nothing about it was grand or extraordinary. And yet it was the moment she thought of when she thought of what had been built here on this ground in this life. The cedar post with its rusted marker at the eastern edge of the property, the deed folded in the tin box, the rifle on its rack above the fireplace where it hung now more as memory than necessity, the apple trees growing in the east yard, the children down by the creek, the man crossing the field toward her. She had stood at her property line with everything she owned and everything she owed and everything she feared in the world on one side or the other of a cedar post in the Cimarron Strip, and she had held her ground, and the ground had held. And then the ground had given her more than she had known to ask for. By the time 1895 arrived, the Holloway homestead, as most in the area had come to call it, though Minnie kept the Bailey name on the deed as well in honor of the man who had first broken that earth, had expanded to nearly 220 acres, a portion purchased and a portion filed through the expanded homestead provisions. The south pasture ran a small herd of cattle now. Thomas's contribution of knowledge and Minnie's contribution of the capital she had carefully accumulated from 3 good crop years in succession. The house itself had been expanded too, a proper second story added in '93 by a carpenter from Caldwell whom Thomas had hired, and then largely assisted, because Thomas turned out to have a genuine gift for building things, which he said he had discovered only by necessity, but which Minnie thought was simply one of the many capacities he had arrived in her life carrying without full knowledge of their extent. The 3 apple trees in the east yard were now 5, 2 more added in '92, and they were productive and established, and in the fall their fruit filled the cellar in preserves and dried rings, and the hard cider that Thomas made in a barrel behind the barn, which was very good, and which he gave freely to neighbors, and which had perhaps contributed more to their social standing in the area than anything else. Ruth Schraber remained 3 miles west, and she remained the person Minnie went to when she needed counsel from someone who had known her before and after, in the way that very old friendship functions as a kind of anchor. Judge Marsh retired from the circuit court in '94 and came through the territory on a farewell tour of the cases he considered most worthwhile, and he stopped at the Holloway homestead and ate supper with them, and held Margaret on his knee, and listened to Gerald Thomas recite the States of the Union, which the boy had memorized for the sheer pleasure of having memorized them. And when he left, he shook Thomas's hand for a long time and kissed Minnie's hand in the formal old-world way he had and said, "This is what it is supposed to look like," which Minnie understood to mean not just the house and the land but the whole of it. Elias Webb came out less often, as his age made writing difficult, but he wrote letters, and his letters arrived with the same careful, measured quality of his speech, full of legal updates and local news and occasional dry observations on the human condition that Minnie found genuinely funny. There was one matter that took longer to resolve than the others, and that was the matter of the families who had been displaced by Voss before the investigation. There were 6 families that Minnie knew of by name, people who had left the territory under pressure, or who had never had their claims restored even after Voss's indictment, because the legal machinery was slow, and the territory was large, and individual cases got lost in the aggregate. Thomas began making inquiries on behalf of one such family in the fall of '91, a couple named Harkins who had been pushed off 80 acres to the south of Voss's main operation, and who were now living in Wichita in circumstances that were not destitute, but were not what they had worked for. It took 2 years of correspondence and 2 trips to Guthrie and 1 appearance before Judge Marsh's replacement, a Judge Culver who was nearly as good, and in '93 the Harkins family received a restored claim and a partial financial settlement from the seized assets of the Voss operation. They came back to the territory. They stopped at the Holloway homestead on their way out to their land, and Mrs. Harkins, a woman of about 45 with a face that had been through considerable weather and remained undaunted, held Minnie's hands and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the holding did not already convey. Thomas quietly pursued 2 of the other displaced families over the following years with the same methodical persistence he brought to everything. He did not talk about it much. He did it because it needed doing, and because he understood that the fighting of injustice was not a single battle but a series of them, and that you took on the ones you were positioned to take on. Minnie watched this and loved him more for it, which she had not thought was possible given how much she already did, but love, she had learned, was not a fixed quantity but an expanding one. Gerald Thomas was 6 when he first asked about his grandfather, the original Gerald for whom he was named. Clara was the one who told him, because she was the one who remembered, and she told it carefully and well, sitting with her little brother under the apple trees on a September afternoon with the fruit coming ripe and heavy on the branches. She told him about their father Gerald, who had been a good man who worked hard and loved their mother completely and had not been perfect because no one was, and who had come west looking for something real and had found it and had not lived long enough to see it secured. She told Gerald Thomas that he had his grandfather's eyes, which was true, and that their grandfather had driven the cedar post at the property line himself, and that the land they were sitting on was land Gerald Bailey had broken and believed in, and that his name on the boy was a way of saying that the story continued. Gerald Thomas listened to all of this with the serious attention of a 6-year-old for whom information is extremely valuable, and then asked if Grandfather Gerald had been good at mathematics, because he himself was not very good at mathematics and wanted to know if it was inherited. And Clara laughed the helpless laugh she rarely gave to adults, and Thomas, who was rounding the corner of the house at that moment and caught the tail end of it, looked at Minnie, who was standing at the kitchen window, and raised his eyebrows in inquiry, and she shook her head and smiled, because some moments were their own complete things and did not need annotation. The deed. She thought about the deed sometimes, what it had meant to hold it at that cedar post on that early morning when the dew was still on the grass and fruit, and his men were coming up the trail, what it had taken to have it in her hand and mean it. The deed was in the tin box, which was in the house, which was still standing and more than standing because it had been added to and improved, and was now a real and substantial structure with glass windows, and a proper floor and bookshelves that Thomas had built against the east wall of the main room to house the books that had accumulated over the years, the mail-order readers and the novels and the histories, and the agricultural journals and Clara's bookkeeping texts, and Gerald Thomas's geography primers. The Winchester was on its rack. She still knew how to use it. She hoped she would not need to. The territory was quieter now than it had been, the violence of the early homestead years giving way to something more settled, not peaceful in the way that meant nothing happened, but organized in a way that meant there were structures for managing what happened, courts and sheriffs, and the ordinary commerce of community that made the worst of the arbitrary power somewhat harder to exercise. But the rifle stayed on its rack because the land was hers, and she did not forget that it had been contested, and she did not pretend that contested things stayed resolved without vigilance. You held what you built. You watched the horizon. You kept the rifle cleaned and the deed registered, and you knew your neighbors and built alliances, and participated in the processes that made civilization something more than just the rule of whoever had the most horses and the fewest scruples. Minnie was 35 years old in 1895, which did not feel old, though she knew some people would call it so. She was not the woman who had buried Gerald at 29 and been left with a child and a deed and a rifle and the bare will to hold the line. She was also entirely that woman. The two were not contradictions. Thomas was 38, and the territory son had done more work on his face, but the essential quality of it was the same, that careful, attentive openness, except that it was easier now, less guarded, the wariness of a man who has been alone and at risk, softened into something more relaxed by years of having a specific and beloved place to be. They sat on the porch on the evenings that the weather allowed, which were most evenings in the territory where the outside was an extension of the inside. In a way, it was not in more enclosed places. They sat with coffee or cider, depending on the season, and talked, or did not talk in the comfortable alternating way of people who have learned each other completely enough to be silent together, without it meaning anything except comfort. Clara was usually off in her room with her books, which were her great pleasure, or writing the long letters she had begun sending to a young man in Caldwell named Henry Pierce, son of their neighbors the Pierces, who was a genuinely good person as far as Minnie could assess him, which she had assessed him rather thoroughly. Thomas had assessed him too, in the way of a man who loves a girl and wants to be sure, and had arrived at a cautious approval which was the strongest endorsement Thomas gave to anything. Gerald Thomas was usually asleep by the time the evening porch time arrived, or supposed to be, and was in fact often at his window watching the yard with the focused interest of a boy who suspected the night contained things worth knowing about. Margaret, at 4, slept like a stone the moment she was placed in bed, which was a quality her parents appreciated enormously after Gerald Thomas's early years of dedicated resistance to sleep. So they sat on the porch, Minnie and Thomas, and the territory spread out in every direction, and the stars came up the way they did, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and the Chuckwill's widows called from the cottonwoods, and the cattle moved somewhere in the south pasture with the low, contented sound of animals settled for the night, and the apple trees stood in the east yard, and the cedar post with its rusted marker stood at the property line, and the tin box in the house held all the papers that said this was theirs. "Are you happy?" Thomas asked one such evening, not in the way of a man who doubts it, but in the way of a man who wants to hear it said, because the saying of it is also a form of the having of it. Minnie held her coffee cup with both hands and looked out at the dark spread of the land she had held and kept and built into something that would outlast her. "Yes," she said. It was a simple word, and she said it simply, and she meant it completely. "Are you?" "Thoroughly and completely," he said. "In a way I did not know was possible when I was the kind of man I was before." She looked at him. In the dark his face was made of shadows and the small, warm light from the window, and she knew it anyway, every line and angle of it, the way she knew the curve of the cedar post and the weight of the Winchester and the smell of the kitchen garden in the morning. "You were always the kind of man who could be this man," she said. "You just needed somewhere to be it." He turned and looked at her with everything open in his face, and took her hand and held it, and did not say anything more because there was nothing more to say. The Chuckwill's widow called. The cattle moved. The stars wheeled overhead in their enormous, indifferent, beautiful, slow revolution. The children slept inside the warm house. The apple trees stood in the yard. The deed was in the tin box. The rifle was on its rack. The cedar post with its rusted marker stood at the eastern edge of the Bailey Holloway property, exactly where it had always stood. And Minnie Bailey, who was also Minnie Holloway, who had stood at that post in the early morning dew with everything she owned and everything she feared and everything she refused to surrender arranged around her like armor, sat on the porch of the home she had fought for and built and filled with love and with life, and she was home. She was absolutely, fully, completely home. The seasons turned over the Cimarron Strip with their habitual indifference to anything human beings felt about them, and the Holloway homestead moved through them, rooted in the earth that two people had decided to call theirs and had defended and worked and loved into something real and lasting. The cedar post stood. The apple trees grew. The children grew. The love that had begun at a property line, with a deed in one hand and a rifle in the other, and a stranger on the wrong side of both, grew too, deeper and more complex and more fully understood with every season. And it was the kind of love that does not surprise itself anymore, but has become something better than surprise, which is certainty, which is the knowledge of a thing so thoroughly held that it can never again be taken from you.